In this tutorial, I'm going to cover how to catch a second color um, when knitting across a second color. So we're knitting across one color, going to be catching a second color, specifically to create tension on that before we actually transition to the color, and then to create tension on the color that you've transitioned from so that you don't end up leaving a big hole where the colors change. In addition, you get kind of the benefit of having half of your tail woven in before you even get to the part where you have to weave in your tails. So that's a little bit of a benefit. I am going to be demonstrating this several ways. So because I'm an English knitter, I am going to demonstrate how to do this English style. And then I'm actually going to do my best to demonstrate how to do this continental style. I'm not great at continental knitting, but I think for the purpose of this specific technique, I can show you at least how to do it fairly competently. So I'm going to do that. So there are timestamps in the video description. If you jump down to the bottom, open up the description, there are timestamps that go to the specific parts. So I'm going to show one way to do this English style. I'm going to show two different ways to do this continental style. So one way is if you're holding both your working yarn and the color that you're transitioning that you want to catch. If you're holding both of those in your left hand, and then I'm going to show also how to, if you knit continental, but you can manipulate the color that you want to catch with your right hand. So I'm going to show both of those. And then in addition to showing how to do this when you're working into a knit stitch with a knit stitch, I'm also going to show you how to do this. So I'm going to show you how to do this when you're working a knit stitch that's worked into lace. So if I have for instance, if I wanted to work into this section where I have a lace stitch and I want to catch the color when I'm working in the knit rows, I'll show you how to do that. But again, you just want to use the timestamp to jump, and I'll show you how to do all three again with the holding the yarn in your right hand, holding the working yarn in your left hand, but the yarn you're catching in your right hand, and then holding both in your left hand. So okay, to do this English style, if you hold your working yarn in your right hand, you want to, from where you need to make your transition, you want to come back a multiple of 2 stitches plus one more. So I recommend, so for every multiple of 2, you're going to get 1 catch. So I recommend at least 4 times 2 and then plus 1. So that'll give you four different catches, and then the plus 1 will just make sure that you end on the correct stitch. So I have come back from where my beginning of round is, a total of 9 stitches. To begin, you want the yarn that you're transitioning to, the one that you're going to be catching, you want the tail of that to be coming to your right and the working yarn to be coming to your left. You're going to go ahead and insert your right needle into the next stitch as if to knit it, and then bring that yarn you want to catch just around the needle. So it's going to come, your yarn going to the ball, or the working yarn is going to be going to your left, and then the tail is coming around the front of the needle and then over the top to your right. So you're just going to drape that around the needle, and you do want it to be both the tail and the working yarn to the left of your working yarn. Sorry, both the tail and the yarn going to the ball of your color that you're catching should be to the left of your working yarn. Then you're going to make your stitch as usual, and then you just want to bring that back off the needle. So whether you're doing this with your left hand or you wrap that stitch and then you bring that back off with your right hand, you just want to remove the stitch from around the needle before you complete your actual working stitch. All right. So if you look here on the back, I'm going to kind of tug on this. So at first I want you to look here on the front. It looks like that yarn that you caught just came through, but if you give it just a little tug, it's going to disappear from the front of your work entirely. But you should see where both of those that is caught here on the back of your work with that strand that's coming from the second stitch from the end to the first stitch that you just made. So it's kind of coming in between those. Now, if you pull on it, it's still going to be somewhat loose, but it should be secured enough that you can continue working now. And from this point, you're just going to be working with the yarn that's going to the ball, so you want to make sure that you don't accidentally grab your tail. Now, the way that this ends up, it should be that the yarn that you're catching is now draped over the working yarn that you're of the color that you're working with. So it should be coming over and to the left of that. That's okay. That's how you want it. So from here, you're just going to make a stitch as usual. And what that's going to do is it's going to catch this again on the back side right here. So you make your next stitch. All right, and then we're going to do this again. So now again, we're working with the yarn that's going to the ball of the color you're catching and not the tail end. So insert your right needle into the next stitch, and then either using your left hand. So I like to use my left hand because I can just drape it around. I can just kind of have it hanging out back here and then pull it around like this. But if you would rather use your right hand, you can just lift it up, bring it around the needle. So it's going to come from the back of the work over the top of the needle and then around the bottom of the needle away from you. Wrap your stitch as usual and then bring that back off. And then when you go to make your next stitch as usual, again, it's going to get caught here between your working yarn and the next stitch. So you're just going to make a stitch as usual. And it's going to catch it again here. And you're just going to do this over and over again. So insert your needle into the next stitch, bring that color you want to catch from the back over the top of the needle towards you and then around the bottom away from you. Make the next stitch as usual and then bring that back off. That color you're catching back off. Finish the stitch and then make another stitch as usual with that yarn. Again, that color that you're catching is just coming over the top of your working yarn, and you make the next stitch as usual. Again, it can pull through here, but as soon as you give it a little tug toward the back, it's just going to disappear from the front. You won't be able to see these at all. When you catch your yarn and you have it tensioned correctly, you should not be able to see it at all from the front of your work. So you're just going to continue this all the way until you get to your stitch marker. So insert the needle, wrap the color you're catching from top to bottom around the front of the needle, wrap your stitch as usual, bring that yarn you're catching back off, complete the stitch, make another stitch as usual, and again that's going to come over, your working yarn is going to come over the color you're catching to make that next stitch. And then one more catch here at the end. So wrap from top to bottom, wrap your stitch as usual, bring that back off, complete the stitch. So once you get to the point where you're going to transition to using the color that you've been catching, before you start knitting with the new color, I would recommend just giving your tail a nice little tug just to make sure that everything is pulled out pretty flat here and that you can't see any of those catches on the front at all. And so you just want to give your tail a little bit of a tug. You should be able to, when you tug it correctly, if you did these catches correctly, it should be able to move back and forth. You just don't want to tug it too tight. You don't want to mess up the tension on your current stitches, and you do want to leave enough of a tail at the end that you can still weave in. So for instance, my tail, this is coming to the very end of the yarn where I have a little bit of undyed yarn here. And so before I weave this in, I'm probably going to clip it just above that where the dye change is. So I do want to make sure I have a good, 4 or 5 inches that I can still weave in the rest of that tail comfortably. But you don't want to weave in any more than you already have caught here until after you've blocked, because you don't want the weaving of this tail to end up restricting the blocking of the stitches. And then from here, once you've corrected the tension on all of your catches on one side of the transition, you can go ahead and begin the transition to using your new color. So for instance, here I'm at my beginning of round, so that's where I would transition to my next color. And then you can begin from there to work with the new color catching the old color as you go across. So your tension on the color that you're catching at this point should feel just about as secure as the tension on the color that you were knitting with. So from this point on, you're just going to switch which color you're catching. So once you get to the transition point where you're going to be picking up the yarn that you have been catching, and then you're going to be catching the yarn that you were working with, you just want to, so your yarn at this point, your color that you've been catching should be slightly to the right of the color that you were working with. You want to bring that over the color that you were working with, and that's the one that you're going to be catching now, and just make that first stitch. Then from here, we're going to catch a stitch with the old color. So you want to bring that from underneath, wrap it around the needle from top to bottom. So over the top towards you and around the bottom away from you. Wrap your new next stitch as usual, and then bring that back off the needle. The color you're catching comes back off the needle. Finish the stitch, and then that should be over. At this point, it should be over your working yarn. So then you're going to make another stitch. You're just going to work a stitch as usual with your new color, and then do this again. So insert the needle into the next stitch, bring the yarn you want to catch up and over the needle. So it's coming from underneath your working yarn, up and over the needle, around the top, over the top towards you, around the bottom away from you. Knit the next stitch as usual and bring that back off the needle. The yarn you're catching comes back off the needle. Finish the stitch, and then work another stitch as usual. Do that again. So I kind of show you here how I do it with the yarn I'm catching in my left hand at this point. So I insert my needle into the next stitch, and I just kind of have that held in my left hand. I'm going to bring it around the needle from the back to the front over the top, like so. Make my stitch as usual, and then slide that back, the color I'm catching, back off the needle. Finish the stitch, and then just make the next stitch. And then I'm going to catch it again, so I'm just going to bring that toward me so it comes over the top of the needle. Wrap my stitch, bring that back off the needle, finish the stitch, make another stitch. Do that one more time. So insert my needle into the next stitch, bring that color I want to catch over the needle from back to front, over the top, then wrap my stitch as normal, bring that yarn I'm catching off the needle, and then finish the stitch, and then make another stitch. So once you have as many catches as you want, you're going to use the tails of, so this is the tail of the color that I've been catching past the color transition. Here's the tail of the color I was catching before the transition. And you can just give those tails a tug. So once you give the tails a bit of a tug, they should feel fairly snug to the fabric. And if you look really closely, the yarn that you've been catching should basically form a nearly straight line coming under the places where it's being caught all the way across. But then when you turn to the front of the work, you should not be able to see any of those catches through on the front at all. So if you look really carefully, you can see the color I was going to transition to. So my lighter blue, I've got it caught here, 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 here. All right. So you want to leave plenty of tail to weave in after as well. So I recommend 6 to 8 inches of tail after you've cinched everything down at the transition. And then from here, you can tension the yarn that you were catching after you transition to the new color on the other side. And again, you can see here on the back of my work where it's caught here, 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 and right there. All right. So all those catches is going to just ensure that the tension at this join, for instance, so in this particular project, I have a line of yarn overs that's coming up to where this transition is. So if I didn't catch my yarn on either color, on either side of this transition, where I switch yarn colors would have left a pretty big gaping hole right here. And it can be hard to get the tension of that correct after you begin knitting, just because it's so close to those yarn overs. So that is how you do it if you knit English style. So if you are a continental knitter, you hold your working yarn in your left hand. If you feel like you can manipulate the yarn that you want to catch with your right hand, that's where I'm going to start here. If you want to be able to do this with both yarns held in your left hand, jump ahead to the next part of the video. All right, so to do this, you're going to, first we need to catch this tail in here. So go ahead and insert your right needle into the next stitch, and then you want the tail of your working yarn, or the yarn that you're catching, you want the tail of the yarn you're catching to be coming to the left, and the yarn going to the ball to come to the right, and just kind of drape it over the right needle. And then you want that, so that you want, kind of want that tail to be coming in between those two needles. And then go ahead and wrap your stitch. All right. And then bring that back off. Oops, still not doing this right. Okay, try that again. Okay, so basically you want to drape your tail to the left over your working yarn right here. Okay, so just kind of tuck it in there. Go ahead and make your first stitch. So into the needle, make your stitch. Sorry, my tension on my yarn here is not great. Try that again. All right. So make your first stitch. All right. So at this point, your yarn that you're catching should be caught in between these two stitches. So kind of behind the work between those two stitches. You want to make sure to bring your tail down from that, and then you're going to be working with the yarn that's going to the ball of the color that you're catching. From here, you're going to work a stitch as normal. Sorry, again, my tension on Continental is not great, so bear with me. All right, and then every other stitch, you're going to insert your needle into the stitch, bring the yarn that you're catching over the top of, so it's coming over the working yarn between the needle and the working yarn, and then you're going to work a stitch, and then you're going to bring that back over the working yarn. The yarn that you're catching needs to come back over to the right, work another stitch. Insert your needle, bring that color you're catching to the left between the needle and the working yarn, then bring it back over to the right, make a stitch as usual. Insert your needle, bring that color you're catching to the left between the needle and the working yarn, make a stitch. So at this point, you should be able to see it's probably, the color you're catching is probably poking through on the front. Don't worry about that. When we get to the transition, we're going to change the tension. But basically, all you're going to have to do is give your tail a little tug. So if you watch while I'm tugging that tail, that place that I'm catching is just going to disappear from the front. All right, and the more I tug on my tail correctly, it's just going to disappear. So it is going to pull that to the back. You just got to give it a chance, okay? It is going to be kind of tight, so just be aware of that. So if you want to tug it out by tugging on the working yarn for each stitch, you can do that as well. All right, so after you make that stitch where you catch it, you're going to bring that yarn you're catching back over to the right, make a stitch as usual, insert the needle into the next stitch, bring it to the left, finish the stitch. And again, if you want to tug here, you can. Bring it back to the right and make that last stitch. Okay? So from this point, if you look on the back, you should see that your yarn that you've been catching, it's caught here, 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 here. All right, so you should be able to still stretch out the stitches where it's caught, and you should be able to tug the yarn that you've been catching in either direction. It might take a minute to get it to move the first time. It might feel a little snug, but you should, and you want to make sure once you get to the transition that you do get all of the excess out of that yarn before you continue knitting with this color that you've been catching. And you want to make sure that you leave a long enough tail past the catch that you can still weave in however many stitches you would normally weave in your tail. So yes, you've woven it in somewhat. I would recommend that you weave the rest in, 4 or 5 stitches in the other direction, but after you've blocked, because you don't want this catch that you've been doing here to restrict you being able to block out your project as normal. Okay, so once you have that yarn caught, then you can just transition to working with the color. So you should have about as much tension on the yarn that you've been catching as the yarn you've been working with. You just, wherever you do your change, for instance, here I'm doing it at the beginning of round, so I slip my beginning of round marker, and then I'm just going to switch to working with the new color and catching the old color the same way. So I'm going to make a stitch, and then I'm going to, on this next stitch, I'm going to catch my yarn. So I'm going to go into the next stitch. I'm going to bring the color I want to catch to the left between my needle and my working yarn, and then make my stitch, and then bring it back to the right, the color that I just caught. I'm going to bring it back to the right and make a stitch as usual. And then I'm going to catch it again. So insert my needle into the next stitch, bring the yarn I want to catch between the needle and the working yarn, make the next stitch, bring it back to the left, make a stitch as usual. Into the stitch, bring it to the left, make another stitch, bring back to the right, make a stitch as usual. So once you've caught your yarn, however many times you want to catch it on the other side, you can go ahead and cut your tail. You just want to make sure, again, that you have cinched down the tension. So you should be able to feel the tension of this coming all the way back to this last stitch. And then when you cut your tail, you just want to make sure you've got your stitches all nice and spread out here so it's not too tight. It's not restricting these stitches. And you want to make sure you cut a long enough tail that you can still weave it in on the back of the work after you've blocked. All right, so that is catching your colors. If you are knitting continental, but you can manipulate the color you're catching with your right hand. Okay, if you are a continental knitter and you want to hold both the color that you're working with and the color that you're catching in your left hand, I just want to let you know up front, this first catch is going to be a little finicky just because you're not going to have any tension on your color that you're catching. You want to make sure that your yarn is coming around your hand with the tail to the right, and you have plenty of tail there. I've got like probably 10 inches here. And then do what you can to tension that as well, just with your hand, however you can hold some tension on that. But you do want the color that you're catching to be further away from your needles than the color that you're working with. Okay, so however you normally hold your tension on your yarn in your left hand, you want the working yarn, your working color, to be closer to you, closer to the needles, and the color that you're catching is going to be further away. So catching your color this way involves working a stitch with a catch with a specific maneuver, and then the stitch without the catch, you're just making sure that you're working into the working yarn correctly. So I'm going to go through this kind of slowly the first couple of times. So to do the catch, you're going to go into the next stitch. You're going to insert your right needle into the next stitch, and then you want to bring the tip of your needle under both colors of yarn, and you want it to come over the top of the color you're catching, slide under the color that you're going to be working with, and then around over that, and then come through to make the stitch. All right, so your tension here is going to be kind of important with that first stitch. I would recommend, if you need to, use your right hand to kind of cinch everything to make sure that the tension stays there, especially as you're trying to catch this tail the first time. And what that's going to do is it's going to put a twist in the yarn. So you can see right here, my working color is twisted around the color that I just caught. And in order to undo that twist, on the next stitch, I'm going to go into the stitch and then bring my needle above where the yarn's twisted. So if you look here, my yarn's twisted down here, so I'm going to insert my needle above the twist to make my next stitch. And what that's going to do is it's going to untwist those yarns, and it's going to catch the yarn again. So it performs both of those functions. And then for each stitch, I'm just going to do a catch and then a regular stitch. So the catch, again, into the stitch. So with your right needle, go into the stitch under both colors, over the color you're catching, under the color that you're working with, and then around back over the color you're working with and into the stitch. So complete the stitch. That's going to twist up the yarn, and then you're going to make a regular stitch, go into the stitch, and then grab the color that you're working with from above the twist to make the next stitch. And you're just going to do this all the way through. So if you have the correct number of stitches to the transition, you should end with your yarn like this. The last stitch should be making a normal stitch above the twist. So catch a stitch, into the stitch, under both, over the color you're catching, under the color you're working with, around and back over that color, and then down and through the stitch, complete the stitch, and then make a stitch as normal, but make sure you grab that working yarn from above the twist and bring it through. So catch a stitch, under both, over the color you're catching, under the color you're working with, and then around back over, through the stitch, and then make a stitch as normal with the color that you're working with. Make sure you grab it above the twist and come through. All right, so catch a stitch, under both, over the catch, over the working, back around over that and through, and then make a stitch as normal by going up above the twist to grab that. All right, so depending on your tension of the color that you were catching, you may need to grab your tail here and just do a little bit of adjusting. So when you do this, when you grab this on the back, and you just want to make sure you don't pull to the left and pull stuff off your needles, but you should be able to basically pull from one end and feel it moving on the other end. So whichever way you want to pull it, you should be able to do that. It's just gonna kind of have to hold your stitches still a little bit to do it, but you should be able to do that, okay? And you just want to make sure that your stitches are nice and spread out before you, once you do this tension, and then you should have, it should be snug back here. So basically the color that you've been catching should be coming, it's getting caught, and the stitches that are catching it, you should have a definite lean to the, so you should have a stitch kind of leaning to the, or where it's caught should be leaning to the right, and then to the left, and then to the right, and then to the left. Whoops. To the right, to the left, to the right, to the left, to the right, to the left. All right, but it should look like basically a straight line of yarn coming through where it's getting caught on the back of the work. Hope you could see that. Sorry, sometimes I drift out of frame a little bit. So once you've caught your color, your tension, when you're just working normally, so if you grab your working yarn here and you kind of feel your tension to that stitch, the tension on the yarn that you were catching should feel pretty similar. All right, so if I grab this and I tug really hard, I can begin to pull excess out of the tail. And again, you want to leave enough of a tail. This is probably a little too long, but you do want to leave plenty of room after the catch so that you can weave in the rest of that tail comfortably. Okay, so a little bit too much excess on the end is better than not enough excess on the end. You also want to leave enough. It's not just about weaving in. You just want to make sure that you don't have it cinched down really tightly here, because then when you go to block, because you're working with this color, when you go to block, it is going to restrict your ability to stretch those stitches out. So you want to make sure you have enough excess here in the tail that if you need to, when you go to block, you can stretch those out more. But then once you have the tension on the yarn that you've caught pretty good, you should be able to, like when you look at your stitches from the front, you shouldn't see any of the places where you've caught it coming through. So I've got one little place right there. So You should be able to look from the front and not see the color you were catching at all. All right. Then when you switch colors at the transition here, so I'm just going to transition to the other color. Go ahead and start with you're going to have to change up your working yarn here. All right. So I recommend that you, sorry, I want to make sure I'm doing this right. Yeah, I recommend that your color that you're transitioning from, this is the one that you're going to be catching, is coming across the top to the right, and the color that you're going to be working with now is coming from underneath on the bottom to the left. So again, the color you're working with, you want it to be closest to your needles. So then start with a stitch made normally. So just make a stitch as usual. Get your tension pretty secure. And then you're just going to be doing the same maneuver. You're just catching the opposite color now. All right. So into the stitch, under both, over the color you're catching, under the color you're working with, and then around back over that color that you're working with, and then bring it through the stitch. And then you're going to make the next stitch normally. You're just going to make sure you grab that working yarn above the twist. Hopefully better than I did just now. All right. And that should untwist them, and then they should be straight again. So catch the color again. So under both, over the one you're catching, under the one you're working with, and then around and over the one you're working with and through the stitch. And then make the next stitch as usual, making sure you grab the working color from above the twist. And you're just going to do that several more times. Catch a stitch, work a stitch as usual, catch a stitch, work a stitch as usual. And you do want to end working a stitch as usual. All right. And once you've done the number of catches that you want to do past the transition, you're going to do the same thing with the yarn that you've been catching, your old color. You just want to give it a tug. You should be able to feel a little bit of tension coming here to where it transitions. But it should seem like it's coming basically straight across, and then the catches are just going over each place that it's catching. You want to make sure it's nice and stretched out so that when you go to block your work, it's not restricting that at all. And then because I'm working into stitches that are the same color as the color that I've been catching here, it's not going to be quite as easy to see whether or not you can see it from the front just because it's the same color. But once your tension is good back here, you should be able to adjust that if you need to. Just make sure you cut a long enough tail after you've finished with that color that you can adjust it afterwards if you need to, and you still have room to weave it in. All right, so that is catching your color if you want to knit continental and hold both yarns in your left hand. Okay, so this part of the tutorial is pretty specific to an actual pattern. So if you have been following along with the Expression Fiber Arts 2025 Mystery Knit Along, which is the purport pattern from Jenica Carter, every time you start a new clue, you're transitioning from one color to another if you're doing the color changes as she recommends. So you can do this all in one color. I'm actually making a one color version. I really like it. But if you're transitioning between colors and you want to catch your yarn, it's not always going to work. So when you do the transition on from clue 1 to clue 2, you're basically going from a knit row to a knit row. So it's pretty easy to do that color transition because you're knitting into knit stitches on one side and catching the color, and then knitting into knit stitches on the other side and catching the color. But if you're doing the transition from clue 2 to clue 3, that doesn't work because the last row of clue 2 is a patterned row. That is, it has yarn overs, it has stitches where you slip a stitch and then you lift that slip stitch over, so you can't really catch the yarn on the last row of clue 2, and you can catch it on the first row of clue 3 because it's a knit row. So I'm going to show you a trick to catch your yarn at the end of the first round See, I said row, it's really round. You're catching your yarn at the beginning of the round. You can catch your new color, whatever color you're transitioning to, you can catch at the beginning of round 3 or round 1 of clue 3 because it is a knit row. So or knit round, you can knit into and catch, as I've done here, the color that you transitioned from when you're knitting with the color that you transitioned to. So instead of catching my color that I was transitioning to at the beginning of, or at the end of my clue 2, so that last round, the end of that last round, I'm instead going to catch that at the end of my first round of the next clue. So when I'm working these knit stitches is when I want to catch this. So in order to do this, you have to do it a little bit differently. So first of all, I want you to note that my tail is huge. Okay, so this is like a 14-inch tail. It's very long. And the reason that I did that is because I basically have to catch this backwards. I want the tail to still be going this way, but I can't catch the stitches in that order leading up to, so I have to catch the stitches starting on the tail end and then adjust my tail accordingly when I get to the color transition. All right, so if you are an English knitter, let's start with that. And then if you are a continental knitter, you can jump ahead to either one of the continental demonstrations. All right, so the confusing thing about this is instead of having 2 colors to work with, you are going to be working, you're going to be catching the same color you're working with. All right, so remember, we're catching this color that we transitioned to at the end of when we changed to the new round. And so we're already working with that color, but we're also going to be catching the end of that color at the end of this round. I hope that makes sense. So if you are an English knitter and you're holding your working yarn in your right hand, you do want to have a total of 9 stitches remaining. So I'm just going to knit one more here. So 5, 9. All right. So 9 stitches remaining, and then you're going to be very careful to make sure that you are doing this from the tail forward. All right. So go ahead and insert your needle into the next stitch, and then you're going to wrap your yarn so that the tail is coming around to your right, and the end that's already secured in your work is to the left, and then you have this huge loop between where you're catching it, and so you want not too much tail on the right side. All right, so go ahead and wrap it from bottom to top toward, so coming underneath the needle towards you, around the front, and then over the top away from you. Wrap your stitch as usual, and then bring that back off. Okay, so if you're doing this entirely with your right hand, just go ahead and insert the needle into the stitch, bring this yarn around the needle so that the tail is coming over the top to the right. All right, and then make sure you don't catch your tail with your working yarn, so kind of come under the tail with your working yarn, and then work around. So wrap the stitch as usual, and then bring that back off and complete the stitch. All right, so then drop your tail to the right, okay, and then your loop should be kind of over here to the left of your working yarn, right, kind of coming over your working yarn like that. Go ahead and make the next stitch, and then what we're going to do is we're going to bring that tail back to the right. So it's a loop. You want to make sure that you're bringing your working yarn through that loop, so the tail of the loop is coming to the right. Go ahead and make the next stitch, and then bring the tail back to the left. Make a stitch, bring that back to the right, make a stitch, bring it back to the left. This is going to keep it from getting twisted up, and it is going to catch it at the same time. Bring it back to the right, make a stitch, and then bring it back to the left and make a stitch. All right. And then one more time to the right, make your final stitch, You want to always make sure you're making your stitches with your working yarn and not with your loop. Okay, so then you should have your loop here, kind of coming around your tail of your working yarn. And what you need to do here is grab the tail end of the color that you were catching, and you're just going to cinch it down. All right, so you want to make sure at this point that you don't accidentally pull stitches off of your left needle. So you want to kind of hold everything securely at this transition, and then make sure that those stitches here at the beginning of the round are nice and close together. And then pull all that excess out, and then just kind of spread your stitches back out. All right, so now you have an extra long tail. You probably don't need that long of a tail, so you can cut it shorter at this point, but you needed that excess for the loop. All right, so now your working yarn should be coming from underneath that last catch, and you can just continue working as normally. So now you've caught your old color, or sorry, you've caught the new color in your old color stitches over here on the right of that transition. Okay, so that is how you would do a catch if you knit English style and you're catching basically into lace or into not knit stitches, just not plain knit stitches, when you don't have that option to do it before the color transition. Hope that makes sense. Okay, if you are doing this catch into, so your previous round would have been some sort of lace work where you can't work a knit round to do this catch into, so you would have just done the transition where you're starting knitting with your new color. You can catch the old color at the beginning where when you're just knitting here with the new color, you can go ahead and catch that old color here. But you're going to want to catch this new color that you transitioned to basically at the end of the round instead. And in order to do that, you need to leave an extra long tail. So my tail here is a good probably 14 inches long. You're not going to need all of that, but you are going to need it to be able to do this technique. So that's why you have to have the extra long tail to do this. So I'm first going to show you how to do this continental style if you can manipulate the yarn with your right hand. It's a little awkward, so if you can hold both yarns in your left hand, it's definitely easier to do it that way. Just because this transition's a little awkward. We're basically creating a big loop, working from the tail end as though it's just a regular piece of yarn, acting as though where it's secured over here is where it's going to the working yarn or going to the ball, but we're catching the yarn from the tail end toward that where it's already secured into your project because you've been working with it. The other thing that's awkward about this is you're actually working with the same color you're catching, so you have to be careful that you're not accidentally working with the color you're supposed to be, or working with the yarn that you're supposed to be catching and catching the yarn that you're supposed to be working with. So you do want to make sure that you're actually catching the right one because they're going to be the same color. Okay. So for this first catch, what you want to do is go ahead and take that tail and just drape it over your working yarn so the tail is coming to your right. All right, and it's just going to be between your working yarn and your project for this first stitch. I do have 10 stitches here, so an even number of stitches to do this is what you want. And you're just going to work a stitch as usual with that tail caught to your right. You don't want to, just a little bit of your tail, maybe 2 or 3 inches at the most to your right. Go ahead and work a stitch as usual with that tail between your working yarn and your project. All right, so from here, we're just going to be manipulating the yarn that is on the other side of this tail. Okay, so we've got a loop here that is coming. If you look, your loop should be coming around your working yarn. Okay, so loop to where the color joins here at the transition, and then your working yarn should basically be under this loop. So you want to make sure you are picking up your working yarn under this loop, and then you're going to be using your right hand to manipulate this loop back and forth. So go ahead and work a stitch as usual. Oops, maybe. Try that again. So work a stitch as usual, and then go into the next stitch and just bring that loop end to the left over your working yarn before you make the next stitch. And then bring the loop end back to the right, make another stitch, insert your yarn into the next stitch, bring the loop end to the left, make the next stitch, loop end to the right, make a stitch, insert this needle into the next stitch, loop end to the left between the needle and the working yarn, make another stitch, loop end to the right, make another stitch, insert the needle into the next stitch, loop end to the left, make another stitch, and then loop into the right to make your last stitch, just normally. All right, so now you should have your loop kind of coming over your working yarn, and at this point you're going to tug on the tail of that loop that you've been manipulating back and forth, right? And you're just going to cinch it down until the two sides come together with the right amount of tension. Being careful not to pull anything off. So you can also pull on the tail of the old color that you cut on the other side and just kind of bring those together till everything meets up nice and snug. All right, the only thing you don't want to do is snug, again, you don't want to snug this down too much. Okay, you still need to be able to block it out. So you want to make sure that there's plenty of room there. You're going to have a lot of excess tail after you do this. If you want to trim it down so that's about the size that you need to weave in, because you do still need to weave it in after you block, you can do that at this point. Okay, so then you should have from the beginning where you caught the old color working with the new color, and then at the end where you've caught the new color working with the new color into these stitches at the end of that round. You should have a good color transition here without those catches showing through. So that is how you do it if you are holding your working yarn in your left hand and the color you're catching is being manipulated with your right hand. Okay, so if you're a continental knitter, you want to hold both yarn colors, or both of the yarns, the working yarn and the yarn that you want to catch, in your left hand. In one way, it's easier to do this than if you are manipulating the yarn you want to catch with your right hand. But in another way, it's a little bit more difficult just because the yarn that you're catching and the yarn that you're working with are the same color. So it's going to be really important that you don't accidentally mix up the two. So to begin with your, so you want to have a multiple of 2 stitches before the color transition. So again, you've already caught the color that so this color that I was working with in the previous round, I caught at the beginning of the round. So my tail for that is over here, way over here past the stitch marker, or past the color transition. So now I'm just catching the color that I started this round with, because I couldn't catch it on the previous round, because you can't catch a color when you're working lace work. It'll show through. So the first thing I want to do is I want to get my my 2 yarns situated. So I do want my working yarn to be coming over my hand closest to the needle, and then I'm going to grab the tail of the yarn that I've already begun working with at the beginning of the round. So this is my tail. I do want it to come under my working yarn, so I don't want it to be coming over that at all. I want it to be coming under my working yarn, and then I'm just going to put it over my hand to the outside so that it's coming from further away. I don't want much of my tail to be, I do need the tail to be coming over my hand to the right, but I don't want it to be too long. I want most of the excess to be to the left of my hand. Okay, so I'm going to be working with this excess, and I don't want to run out. So you just want enough tail that you can kind of cinch it down somewhere as you're working. It can be a little tricky to make this first stitch, because you do need to come under that tail to work the stitch. You're just going to be doing that catch as usual. You just want to make sure you're getting under both colors and not mixing them up. So go into the stitch under both, and then the one that's on the outside you're going to come around over the top of, and then go underneath the one that's inside, and then wrap over that, and then bring it through the stitch. All right, and that's going to create a twist here, and then when I make the next stitch, I'm just going to grab the working yarn, which is the inside yarn, above the twist to make this next stitch. Okay, so it might be worth each time just grab that tail, give it a little tug, and make sure that's still on your outside, on the outside. All right, you don't want to mix these up, because if you start working with what you're trying to catch, it's going to make a mess. You're not going to be able to cinch it down correctly. All right, so then we're just going to catch a stitch. So under both, over the outside, under the inside, and then up and over that inside, and then around and down through the stitch. And then make a stitch as usual, going above the twist and grabbing that inside yarn and bringing it through. And then I'm just going to give my tail a little bit tug again, just to make sure I still have that on the outside. All right, so we're going to catch again. So under both, into the stitch, under both, over the outside, under the inside, and then up and over that inside, and then down and through the stitch. And then make a stitch as usual, coming up above that twist to grab that inside yarn and pull it through. I'm going to do this 2 more times. So again, I am going to pull on my tail, make sure that's the outside yarn, and then I'm going to make another catch. So in through the stitch, under, whoops, don't pull the stitch off the needle. So in through the stitch, under both, under the, over the outside, under the inside, and then up and over through the stitch, and then up above that twist to get my next stitch from the inside. Maybe. Sorry, have I mentioned yet that my continental tension is not great? All right, and I'm going to give another tug on my tail here just to make sure it's still coming to that outside strand. You can see there's that loop here. All right, so when I tried to tension everything down, there's that loop here. Just want to make sure that your working yarn is that outside strand, or that inside strand closer to the needle, and that the outside strand is the one that is going to that tail. All right, so one more catch, under both, over the outside. Sorry, I'm going to separate these just a little bit more, just to make sure. That's going to my loop. All right, so into the stitch, under both, over the outside, under the inside, then up and over that, and through the stitch, and then make this last stitch grabbing above the twist on that inside strand. All right, so at this point, you should have your loop that's going to where your color started over here on the left, and then to where you caught it last over here on the right. And you should be able to just pull the tail to cinch down this loop. You want to make sure you get your working yarn out of the way. Cinch down that loop, okay? And then if you need to, you can grab the yarn that you caught on the other side and just kind of pull both. You just want to make sure you don't pull anything off of your needles until you get the tension across that gap to be about the same, okay? So you're just cinching over here, making sure that your stitches can still spread out across that where you're catching. And then that will have caught your yarn on the back. You've pulled out that excess from the loop, and so you're going to have an extra long tail. You can shorten it here if you want. Just make sure you leave enough to weave back in after you've blocked. All right, and then same thing with your tail over here. If you need to cut that, you can. But that is how you would join and catch your colors if you're working into a lace row. Now, you always have to do this on a knit row. You can't do this on a row where you're working lace stitches or cable stitches or anything else, and I'm not currently showing you how to do this on purl stitches. There is a way to catch your stitches purling, but it's entirely different. So this is just for when you're using, when you're working lace, and you just want to make sure that after you've done the catch and once you've blocked that, so for instance here where I've caught it is kind of showing through, so I would need to pull the tension on that a little bit more just to ensure that none of those catches are showing through once I've blocked it, okay? But there is a way to do that transition with catching your stitch or catching your colors on both sides so that that transition doesn't end up with a big gap. And then it's just less to weave in after you've completed the project and done your blocking. So I hope that's helpful. I hope it's slow enough that you can kind of follow what I'm doing or work with me, and that I've sufficiently demonstrated how to do it no matter how you knit, whether you work English style or continental style. But as usual, if there's anything I didn't show, anything I did too fast, anything that you'd like to see differently, just let me know. I'm happy to try again or make a different video. Just let me know what you'd like to see, and I will do my best to get that done. Can't promise it's going to be fast, but I will do my best to get that done. Thanks.